Rosecrans Boulevard runs from the sands of El Porto Beach, just south of the refinery by LAX, and runs all the way east to Euclid Street in Fullerton for a total of 27.8 miles, which would take about an hour and 20 minutes to drive without traffic. So like 7 hours.
7 hours, 2 days.
If you cross the time zone.
You might have to find a hotel midway.
You better pick up a lot of oil at the refinery because you're going to need it.
Why do beards?
Why do churches always ring at noon? So this is one that isn't about a whole family, but just one man who is a genuine part of United States history here.
Okay.
William Stark Rosecrans.
No way!
I might have learned about it in 4th grade history. You probably didn't. He was born September 6th, 1819 in Kingston Township, Ohio he's got such great names in his family, to Jemima and Crandall Rosecrans.
What are they, part of the witness protection program?
He also had a relative named Marmaduke.
This was the year where names from the Bible were outlawed, so you kind of just had to
pick up a newspaper and grab whatever you see. Unfortunately, it was a Sunday, and he picked up the only colorful page.
This is my son, Kelvin and Hobbs.
The twins.
Kelvin and Hobbs. This is my other son, Peanuts. Hi.
And here's my daughter, Kathy. Marmaduke was a judge, so he was Judge Marmaduke. That has nothing to do with anything, but I had to talk about it.
Oh, so it's my conviction's a joke. Judge Marmaduke. I see the joke now. What do they really vote?
You cannot fit on this couch. I also have to mention that his grandma's name was Thankful. So there was Thankful, Crandall, Jemima, and Marmaduke Rosecrans.
Man, I hope that's the legacy that they gave him the street for.
Give this man a street. Hey, at least it's not Marmaduke. That's also the family motto of the Rosecrans. At least it's not Marmaduke. So clearly this family has a thing with names, but his great-grandpa was Stephen Hopkins. Also,
deceptively normal.
Also almost like somebody else who's more famous. Maybe not more famous, actually. Stephen Hopkins was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Wow, really?
And co-author of the Articles of Confederation, which, again, 4th grade history. I don't know.
Yeah, we all learned about Stark. Yeah. What's his name?
It was something that Sebulba was a part of. He was also distantly related to Benedict Arnold.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, not a great. But as my old joke goes, how much longer till we forgive Benedict Arnold? I mean, come on. It's been like 300 years.
He tried and failed.
And on top of that, the family was originally named Rosecrans. So suck on that, Melissa. I'm not wrong.
I feel like you're doing this segment just to be like, see?
Yeah, we've been feuding about this for years, and finally the man gets to have his say. So William, or Old Rosie as he later became known, never really went to school, but he read a ton of books, and at age 13 he started working at a bookstore because they can't yell at you for browsing if you work at the bookstore.
Yeah, No, I'm not reading them. I'm making sure nothing's in the pages.
William, will you put down those Marmadukes, those hardbound Marmadukes?
No.
Nay.
He's a horse.
His family also moved to Homer, Ohio as a kid, and I think that was a town that someone else we talked about recently was from, but I can't remember who.
Bart.
Bart Simpson. Not that one. So now his family was poor, but young, old Rosie had a dream. He wanted to go to West Point. Unfortunately, that was one of the most exclusive schools in the country that had like 3 schools at the time.
Yeah.
And he was nobody. He was just a poor kid. Sure, his great-grandpa signed the Declaration of Independence, but whose didn't?
What's he done recently?
Yeah, what did you sign recently? Your own funeral check?
A will leaving bad names to your whole family?
I'll leave you all my money if. However, he spoke with a congressman named Alex Harper, who was able to appoint one person to attend West Point, as that was one of his perks of his job.
Yeah.
And Old Rosie impressed him so much that this guy gave his appointment to him instead of his own son, who he had been saving it for.
Don't want to wash the dishes? Fine. See
this
what happens.
Kid does. So Old Rosie got his dream and went to West Point from 1838 to 42, graduating 5th in his class of 56 people, which was every teenage boy in the country was at this school. He developed an interest in engineering there. So after he graduated, he joined the Army Corps of Engineers, and after a year, he became an assistant professor of engineering and also natural and experimental philosophy at West Point. So he was teaching there. But on April 1st, 1854, he decided he wanted to be spending more time with his family, so he resigned from the Army and moved to Cincinnati to become an architect and a civil engineer.
Sin City?
Yeah, he went straight to Vegas. I can't be a professor anymore, and he ripped off his shirt, and he had all these lower back tattoos, and he went straight to Las Vegas.
His reading glasses became like the curvy ones that you buy from a gas station when you have a truck?
Tattooed across his chest was his grandpa's signature on the Declaration of Independence. He got involved in coal mining and kerosene refining, becoming president of the Coal River Navigation Company in Virginia, and he even founded the Preston Coal Oil Company in 1857, but he was also an inventor.
Heard of coal? He made it.
He actually wrote Marmaduke based on his uncle. He invented an odorless oil, a round lamp wick, a lamp chimney, a cheaper way of making soap, and a new type of ambulance.
Oh.
Which would have come in handy when one of his new lamps exploded on him and burned him so badly he was bedridden for 18 months.
Oh my God, that's awful.
And the end of his bed rest, though, coincided with a line I've never gotten to say before on this show, and then the Civil War hit, which is, again, another inside joke I had to explain to a guy who used to work on NPR. He pulled himself out of his bed and slapped on a new coat of skin and rejoined the army, Civil War style. He was a believer.
This is a different origin story of Dr. Doom.
Did he
well, he
lose
burns
his skin or
himself,
something?
depending on the storyline.
How
trying
many
to put his
superhero or supervillains, I guess mostly, started out with skin conditions?
Probably a lot of them.
Yeah, and then there's Deadpool.
Not a villain,
how many unspoken Avengers have eczema that we don't talk about?
Let's talk about them here on our new podcast, Marvel Hero Eczema.
Scratchback. He was a believer in the United States and was anti-slavery. So thankfully for this story, he joined the Union on June 7th, 1861. He was made colonel of the 23rd Regiment, Ohio Volunteer Infantry, whatever that means, and was soon made brigadier general, whatever that means, and then commander of the Department of Ohio, which does mean that he was training soldiers in Ohio for an expected invasion from Confederate forces. Which I always thought Ohio was, I guess it's not really the South, but I assumed Ohio was Southern leaning. Two of these men that he was training, Rutherford B. Hayes, who would go on to become the 19th president of the United States, and William McKinley, who would become the 25th president of the United States until he was assassinated by, you guessed it, Garth Brooks.
I know you're a fan, but you gotta let him go this time. Do not hug him. He's not wearing a mask.
Please. When am I going to get to see William McKinley again? I gotta hug William McKinley. Garth Brooks, you're part of the problem. Military titles make no sense to me, and I find the history of the Civil War to be very confusing. So here are just the general highlights of his time, Old Rosie, during the war.
Are you going to explain states' rights to me? Because I'm not interested.
It's about time you learned about it. It's about time you started making 3/5 compromises with me, and that's all I know about the Civil War. He was at different points in charge of the left wing of the Army of the Mississippi, whatever that means. He took over for both George McClellan, George Harrison, John Lennon, and John Pope. He commanded the Army of the Cumberland, whatever that means, in Nashville, where he fought in the Battle of Stones River. He served under John Fremont in the Mountain Department, whatever that means. Then he led the army to a big victory at Rich Mountain, but after that battle, his old boss, George McClellan, took all the credit for his victory, and eventually George McClellan, got promoted to General-in-Chief of the entire Union Army, and Old Rosie was stuck being shuffled to different smaller armies in different battles.
That sucks.
All the while on his trusty horse, Boney.
Not the horse you want to be on. Doesn't feel good to ride him for like 8 hours.
And as part of George McClellan's promotion, we're taking your host, Mr. Brawny, and we're giving you old Boney. But then he screwed up at the Battle of Iuka, where he won, but he let the enemy escape, which led to Ulysses S. Grant becoming pissed off at Rosecrans, which you do not want, and the two remained pissed off at each other for the rest of both of their lives.
My God.
Then came another big victory at Corinth, for which Old Rosie became a major general, whatever that means, and became the 5th highest ranking general in the Civil War, was Rosecrans. But even so, Grant was pissed off at him because he didn't pursue the Confederates after defeating them.
You let people live?
You didn't make this war even more bloody. So overall, Rosecrans was a very well-respected general, except by Ulysses S. Grant, until he made one big mistake. During battles, Old Rosie had a habit of getting so excited that he'd start stuttering, and people couldn't understand him, and he would also ignore the chain of command, and those two things led to a lot of miscommunication, which finally caught up to him at the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863. So as the war went on, he started to lose his nerves also, and he became less aggressive and more apprehensive about his moves, which explains why he wasn't taking the heads of all of the Confederate soldiers and dumping them on Grant's front porch. So leading up to September, his superiors were telling Old Rosie to advance into Chattanooga, Tennessee, but he didn't want to and fought them on it for 6 months. He said, I'm not going to do it, until he finally did, and he forced Confederate General Bragg out of the city and then chased him further. Finally, he's like, all right, I'm doing it. I'm chasing him. He chased him to Chickamauga. Rosecrans' army had about 60,000 men, and the Confederates only had about 43,000, but he had waited so long to advance that the Confederates actually met up with reinforcements in Chickamauga. It's like A New Hope when he's chasing, he's chasing the stormtroopers. That brought the Confederate numbers up to 60,000 as well. On top of that, because of Rosecrans' habits, there was a huge misunderstanding that created a giant opening for the Confederates to swoop into the ranks of his army and drive them back all the way to Chattanooga.
Jeez.
The Confederates lost over 18,000 men, and Rosey's armies lost over 16,000 men. But they also lost the battle, and it would have been worse had they not been saved by another army who came in at the last minute to help them. This was the second most losses of any battle in the Civil War behind Gettysburg, was Rosey's Folly at Chickamauga. This was seen as unforgivable by Ulysses S. Grant, who came down to Chattanooga personally to relieve old Rosey of his duty, for which he never forgave him for that. Rosey was demoted to commander of the Department of the Missouri, whatever that means, and resigned from service on March 28, 1867 as a brevet major general, whatever that means, and he actually considered suing Grant for ruining his career after the war. But his life was almost very different just a few years before he resigned. Back in 1864, his fellow Democrats were considering him to run against Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election, but he declined to do so because he felt Lincoln was the best person for the job, so he didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
This was the first of many instances like this that gave him the new nickname, the Great Decliner, and his trusty horse, Boney. Then Lincoln himself actually sent him a letter asking him to run as his vice president. But Rosey, Mr. I can never make up my mind, had to think about it for a while because he was a Democrat and Lincoln was a Republican. He eventually decided to do it, but there's two stories here. Either he had taken so long that Lincoln already moved on and chose Andrew Johnson, or his cable was intercepted by Secretary of War, whatever that means, Edwin Stanton, who was with Ulysses S. Grant when he relieved Rosey at Chattanooga, who also hated old Rosey, and this guy purposely took his message and destroyed it. Either way, Rosecrans was not made vice president and missed his chance to become president when Lincoln was assassinated by Garth Brooks, which would have made him not only president, but the first ever Catholic president. He almost became president, but either this guy sabotaged him or he just took too long to make up his mind.
Yeah.
Then in 1865, people in Ohio wanted to nominate him to run for governor, but he also declined to do that. He did, however, accept the job as minister to Mexico in 1867.
Okay.
To better do this job, he moved to California, specifically San Francisco, where he also declined to run for mayor of San Francisco.
The Great Decliner.
He never lets you down in letting you down, but was only here for a little bit, so short of an amount of time that Mark Twain, who was writing for a newspaper there at the time, said that when he left, and off goes General Rosecrans without ever doing anything to give a paper a chance to abuse him. He wanted to move somewhere with better weather, so he went down south, but a little too far. He went to San Diego. During this time, the California Democratic Party tried to nominate him to run for governor of California, which he, of course, declined. But since he was minister to Mexico, he started formulating a plan that would have linked Mazatlan, Mexico. Is that how you pronounce it for me? That's right. You got it, boy.
Yeah, you got it.
So he wanted to connect Mazatlan, Mexico, to New York City by train.
Oh, wow, really?
Which would have been incredible. During this time, he also met with the disgraced Robert E. Lee in an attempt to reunify the United States with something called the White Sulphur Springs Manifesto, which sounds very unreunifying.
Yeah, there's a lot of words in there that
I don't
red
want
flags.
near Robert E. Lee's name.
Exactly.
Sulphur. But then in 1869, his arch nemesis became president, Ulysses S. Grant. One of his first orders of business, firing old Rosey from his job as minister to Mexico.
Wow.
So now he didn't know what to do. The people of Ohio again asked him to run for governor, and he again declined and decided instead to go back to San Francisco, where he became one of the 11 founders of the Southern Pacific Railroad.
Wow, really?
Yeah, but that same year, he finally bought his dream home in the city we've all been waiting for. This one. He bought 13,000 acres of Rancho Salso Redondo for $250 an acre, which covered the land bordered now by Crenshaw on the west, Central on the east, Florence on the north, and Artesia on the south.
Okay.
So that was all owned by this former Union Civil War general. The land mostly produced oats, and he settled down as a gentleman farmer.
That sounds erotic for some reason, and I don't know.
Yeah, he only grew roses and silk robes and like big puffy ties that you would. He was living in a house at what is now Vermont and Rosecrans and Gardena, right by Larry Flint's Lucky Lady Casino, which I'm sure almost first Catholic president would have been thrilled about. The house he lived in was originally built by a squatter named Mr. Cleghorn, which is another cartoon character.
It certainly is. I'm trying to link him and Mark Twain, but there's nothing there. Other than I think that's what Mark Twain sounds like.
His house was built, it was some sort of scheme by the railroad companies to keep Rosecrans from owning the land, but it didn't work. So he did own the land. So here in our very own LA, the Civil War hero settled down for a while, becoming friends with college Hollis P. Huntington, and in 1875 became president of the Safety Powder Company.
Hell yeah.
But
he didn't decline?
If it just makes him profit, he'll do it for but civil service?
No, thanks.
But in 1881, his civic duty did call him back when he finally, opposite of declined something, and became one of the representatives from California in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Oh, cool.
Then in 1884, Grover Cleveland asked him to run as his vice president, and once again, he declined.
As he would,
I
as one does.
I think we heard about it in the Civil War. I think he just has a confidence problem. Where he's
Maybe,
like,
yeah.
I'm not qualified for that. I can't do that.
But also, like, why? So Grant could fire me later?
Grant probably got assassinated by now. I saw him hugging Garth Brooks. Instead, in 1885, he became Register of the U.S. Treasury until 1893. During this time, his signature was on all U.S. currency, and
Wow.
even the pennies. And he oversaw the first and only time a woman was ever on paper U.S. currency with Martha Washington on the $1 bill. That was during Rosie's time. In 1887, he had moved back to L.A. and started becoming a part-time developer, turning his ranch into the town of Rosecrans, subdividing it all into 3,000 lots selling for $50 each. And he even got a railway built from his land to Redondo Beach. But when he resigned as Register in June 1893, he moved to the Hotel Redondo and just became like a guy you'd see everywhere in Redondo Beach.
Oh, that guy who was almost president a couple times?
Yeah, the gentleman beachcomber. He'd be out there with the metal detectors on the beach trying to find Civil War memorabilia, which was like 2 years old.
I know I left something out here. I know that I left like a sword or
anything
something.
of his is Civil War memorabilia, so he was just looking for his watch.
His watch. I left my sword out here somewhere.
I was stabbing a seal, and I think I buried
I was
the
playing
evidence.
pirates with the neighborhood children, and I brought a real sword, and they were like, okay.
His last great honor was receiving the Later Medal in 1895, which is the top award given to American Catholics.
Cool.
Do you hope to get that? I assume you hope to get that one day.
I mean, like, I don't expect it, but I'm kind of working towards anything that'll put me in the path.
I am writing my speech.
I am writing. Yeah, I already have my thank you note in my shirt pocket.
Number 1, God.
God.
Number 2, my pastor.
Number 3, God again.
Number 3, Jesus. Number 4, the Holy Spirit, which is me. But then he caught pneumonia, moved back into his old house in Gardena, and died on March 11th, 1898. His coffin laid in state at LA City Hall, and his funeral was presided over by Bishop George Montgomery, which is the guy that Melissa's high school is named after.
Oh, wow.
This guy's very South Bay, which it shows when you look at pictures of him. It was the largest attended funeral in LA up to that time, and his caskets.
He split them in two.
When you get pneumonia, you see your body just blows apart. His casket was held by 4 Union vets and 4 Confederate vets.
Wow.
And at his grave, they all sang a hymn that I can't believe is actually a hymn, Rock of Ages. I only know it from that musical, and I didn't know.
I bet rock meant something different.
Yeah,
I bet ages meant something different.
They all stood up and sang Meatloaf. So he was buried at Rosedale Cemetery near downtown until 1902, when he was exhumed and reburied at Arlington Cemetery, of course, which was presided over by President Roosevelt. Was at his second funeral. Save a little bit for later. That's what the second casket was for. His house in Gardena was torn down in 1950 so people could get to Larry Flint's casino quicker. And by all means, Rosecrans should be a more well-known figure from Civil War history, but he isn't, and guess why? Ulysses S. Grant, just his grudge. He just kind of like forced him out of the picture, and the history books kind of wrote him out.
He got to edit anything that went into an American history book.
Yeah.
Take this out.
But Rosecrans, the Boulevard, is very well known, at least in music. The first song to ever mention Rosecrans was Rosecrans Boulevard, performed by the Fifth Dimension, but written by Jimmy Webb, who's the guy who wrote MacArthur Park and Up and Away.
Oh, right.
But most people know the name because Rosecrans was the main east-west throughway through Compton and South LA, so a lot of life and a lot of death happened on this street, so it was a common point of focus in LA rap songs, Rosecrans Boulevard. The first rap song to mention it was You Better Bring a Gun by King T in 1887.
It was all on windpipes.
You'll also, of course, know it from California Love by Tupac, which is a song that also does one of my favorite things songs do, which is reference Liberace. So go down to Rosecrans, if for nothing else, for the Liberace references.
That's really all that's there.
So that's Rosecrans, which is weird that he had such a big part of American history and also then moved to Gardena.
Yeah.